Welcome to Confessing the Faith, a theological and devotional walk through the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. I am your host, Sam Waldron, one of the pastors of Grace Reformed Baptist Church and president of Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. We are considering chapter 13 of the Confession, which takes up the important subject of sanctification. We have worked our way through the very biblical assertions of chapter 13's 3 paragraphs. Now, this time together, I want to talk about or perhaps the key passage on definitive sanctification. What do we mean by definitive sanctification? Well, it is simply another way of referring to that basic and radical change that takes place in a sinner's moral and ethical condition when he is united to Christ in effectual calling and regeneration. It reminds us of the fact that progressive sanctification does not take place in a vacuum. It presupposes effectual calling, regeneration, union with Christ, yes, and even justification. Regeneration, like sanctification, affects the change in us, that is to say, in our moral character. See passages like John 3, 3-8, 1 John 2:29, 3, 9, and 10. It initiates the moral change that progressive sanctification enlarges and continues. When we think of sanctification, it's most often of progressive or ongoing sanctification of which we are thinking and speaking. Simply in terms of mere frequency, however, this word sanctification refers more often to definitive sanctification in Scripture than progressive sanctification. The key passage in understanding definitive sanctification is Romans 6, 1-11. The relevance of the passage to the subject of sanctification is found clearly in verses 1 and 2. Romans 6, 1 and 2 reads as follows: "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it?" Paul is specifically addressing the subject of sanctification when he asks the question, shall we go on sinning? He is specifically addressing the subject of definitive sanctification when he remarks, we died to sin. The connection of the passage with Paul's previous argument that is found here in verse 1 is important. Paul has argued that we are not justified by works, but by God's superabounding grace. That's Romans 3:21 through 5:21. He anticipates the objection that such a doctrine permits us to go on sinning so that grace may abound. Paul, in refuting this objection, argues that free justification, as he has described it in Romans 3:21 to 5:21, far from permitting a life of sin, guarantees a new life of righteousness for the believer. The thrust of the passage is found in verse 2. Paul's answer to the question, are we to continue in sin, is not merely that we ought to go on sinning, nor is that we have committed ourselves not to go on sinning, nor is that we have the highest motivations not to go on sinning, nor is it even that it would contradict our profession to go on sinning. All this may be true, but it is not the answer of Paul. Paul's answer is that it is not possible for a justified man to go on sinning. How shall we, who died to sin, still live in it? The word how implies the impossibility of a Christian still living in sin. Every form of teaching that says that salvation may coexist with an untransformed life is destroyed by Paul's affirmation here. Next time, we'll see how Paul argues for a view that a Christian cannot go on sinning because of his definitive sanctification.